It starts with something ordinary, a courthouse hallway, a routine day, and a woman standing quietly minding her business. But then a racist cop decides that today he's going to assert his power, and he picks the wrong woman to mess with. What he doesn't know is that she's not just a bystander, not just another face in the crowd. She's the one woman who can bring his entire world crashing down. What follows is a slow-burning fight for justice, filled with silence, strength, and a reckoning no one saw coming. This isn't just a story about a punch, it's about what happens when quiet dignity meets a system built to look the other way. And believe me, by the time we're done, you'll understand why that moment changed everything. Let us know what time you're listening and where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear your thoughts, your stories, and your voice. On a humid Thursday morning in late September, the Crestwood County Courthouse stood quiet under a gray southern sky, the marble steps slick with overnight drizzle, and the air holding the weight of something unsaid. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed softly against the faded cream walls, and the echo of leather soles on polished tile drifted through the hallway like whispers from ghosts of old trial. Dana Whitmore stepped through the double-glass doors without hesitation, her heels tapping a slow, steady rhythm as she moved across the floor with the calm grace of someone used to attention but uninterested in chasing it. She wore a tailored navy blue dress that hugged her figure with dignity, not vanity, and a light trench coat draped over one arm, her other hand clutching a small black leather folder. She had studied the layout of this courthouse the night before, had traced every corridor, every courtroom, every exit, not because she was paranoid, but because preparation was a kind of prayer. Her eyes scanned the hallway with quiet precision, not lingering on any face, but absorbing everything: the chipped molding on the wall, the sluggish ceiling fan above the clerk's desk, the faint scent of burnt coffee from a vending machine. Tucked near the stairwell, people milled about, some in suits, some in uniforms, others in worn denim and tired eyes. But Dana walked alone, her presence self-contained like a sealed envelope carrying classified truth. A voice called out behind her, sharp, impatient, masculine. "Ma'am, you need to stop right there." She didn't flinch, didn't turn immediately, just slowed her steps and glanced over her shoulder with the kind of look that asks, "Is this really necessary?" The speaker was a uniformed deputy heavyset and red-faced with graying hair, shaved close to the scalp, and a permanent scowl carved deep into the folds of his weathered skin. His badge gleamed under the hallway lights, a nameplate reading Reynolds, though he didn't bother to introduce himself. She stopped, straightened her spine slightly, and waited. The pause between them hung in the air like a fragile bridge neither of them wanted to cross. "ID," he snapped, eyes narrowing, posture aggressive, like someone who'd already decided she didn't belong. Dana didn't react right away. Instead, she measured his tone, noted the way his hand hovered near his belt, not near a weapon, but in that vague, performative way that men use to assert dominance without words. She reached calmly into her coat pocket and held out a driver's license, nothing more. "Is there a reason?" she asked quietly, her voice smooth, not hostile but not deferential either. That tone, measured, confident, perfectly poised, seemed to irritate him more than defiance ever could. Reynolds snatched the ID, looked it over with exaggerated scrutiny, then handed it back without another word. She held his gaze for a brief moment, not to challenge, just to register his face, his eyes, his energy, and then turned away, continuing down the hallway. Behind her, his breath hitched a subtle, barely audible huff of indignation, like someone who just realized he didn't win a game he hadn't admitted he was playing. Dana didn't look back. She didn't need to. She dealt with men like him before, men who saw confidence in a black woman as a personal threat, whose authority felt unstable whenever unbothered elegance walked into a room. Her fingers tightened slightly around her folder, the only visible sign of tension, and she kept walking past the probate court, past the stained glass windows that filtered the morning light into fractured colors across the floor. She could hear her own heartbeat now, not from fear but from the familiar adrenaline that came when environments shifted from merely hostile to potentially dangerous. She paused outside courtroom 3, adjusted her posture, and took a slow breath in through her nose. Around her, no one seemed to notice the interaction that had just occurred. A secretary shuffled papers without looking up. Two young men in button-downs scrolled their phones while leaning against opposite walls. But Dana noticed. She noticed everything. She always did. That was part of the job, part of the life, part of what kept her alive. You couldn't afford to be unaware when you were always walking a line between perception and performance. The bailiff called names from a list taped to the door, and Dana stepped back slightly, avoiding the cluster near the entrance. She wasn't here for drama, wasn't here to make a statement. She had a role to play, even if no one else knew what that role was. Blend in, observe, retrieve, she reminded herself, not for the first time this week. The trick wasn't invisibility, it was unremarkability. Let them see you, but let them forget you just as quickly. She took another breath, looked around once more, and quietly slipped into the room just as the clerk called the next case. The heavy wooden door closed behind her with a deep, low thud, and for a moment it sounded almost like a warning or maybe a drumbeat. Inside her chest, she felt it too. One steady beat, one long inhale, and then silence. The hallway outside courtroom 3 had thinned the morning rush, fading into the low hum of routine government rhythm phones ringing behind frosted glass, distant voices rising and falling like waves too tired to crash. Dana stood at a distance from the door back, straight hands folded lightly in front of her, as if she were waiting for someone who might never arrive. Her eyes were calm, scanning each face that passed not with suspicion but with the quiet curiosity of someone trained to see patterns where others saw randomness. She didn't shift her weight or check her watch. Her stillness wasn't born of uncertainty, but control, every movement rationed with discipline that had been etched into her bones over decades. Reynolds spotted her again from the far end of the corridor, leaning against the beige wall like it was a permanent post, arms crossed tight across his chest. His brow furrowed the moment he saw her eyes, narrowing lips pressing into a thin, pale line. There was something about the way she stood there, poised, yet composed, that scratched at something he didn't know how to name. He pushed himself off the wall with a grunt, the creak of his utility belt announcing his steps, as much as his boots did, each footfall slightly louder than necessary, like punctuation hammered into concrete. As he approached, Dana turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge his presence, not enough to invite conversation. "Still here?" he asked, voice dry-laced with something not quite humor. "You lost, or just sightseeing?" She tilted her head a fraction, offered a polite, measured smile, and replied evenly, "Just waiting." That a problem? It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't even defensive. But to Reynolds it was too much. It was confidence. And worse, it was quiet confidence that didn't ask for permission. His eyes raked over her from top to bottom, pausing just long enough to be noticed, but not long enough to be called out. "You've been lingering," he said, voice louder now, drawing a few subtle glances from nearby. "People tend to get nervous when someone doesn't have a reason to be here." Dana exhaled slowly through her nose, keeping her expression neutral, though her heart picked up pace just slightly, like a drummer warming his hands before a set. "I have a reason," she said, "and I don't need your approval for it." That did it. His face twisted, color rising up his neck like oil creeping across fabric. He took a step closer, invading the space that civility usually guards his breath, carrying the scent of stale coffee and bitterness. "Lady, you think just because you're dressed like someone important you get to walk around here like you own the place." She didn't answer. She didn't blink. She just stood there, her silence louder than anything he could shout. Reynolds' voice climbed, pitched for audience. "Maybe I need to remind you, this is my courthouse. You don't get to ignore me." A couple sitting on the bench looked up, startled. A clerk near the copy machine froze, glancing toward them, unsure whether to step in or disappear. Dana stayed still, her voice quiet but crisp. "You're out of line, officer." And that was the moment, small, precise, irreversible, when the atmosphere shifted from tension to threat. His right hand twitched at his side, his jaw clenched, his pupils shrank. Then it happened. A sudden movement, a blur of force and frustration, the swing of his arm cutting through the space between them like a whip. The impact cracked like dry wood snapping in winter. Dana's head jerked slightly to the left, her hair brushing across her face, her body recoiling just enough to register pain without giving in to it. A collective gasp rippled down the hall. A file folder hit the ground somewhere behind them. No one moved. No one spoke. Not even Reynolds, whose chest rose and fell like a man who didn't yet realize he was underwater. Dana staggered but didn't fall. Her feet held their ground. Her eyes closed for a breath, then opened again, focused, calm, unreadable. She raised one hand to brush a strand of hair from her cheek, her fingers trembling only slightly. She did not speak. She did not cry out. She didn't ask for help. Instead, she looked at him not with fear, not with hatred, but with the kind of silence that makes men like Reynolds feel small. He stepped back instinctively, as if her stillness were more dangerous than any blow she might return. No one approached her. No one asked if she was okay. The hallway had become a graveyard of empathy, and everyone was trying hard not to look like they had seen anything at all. Reynolds muttered something under his breath, something about people like you and respect, but the words hung limp in the air, too cowardly to land properly. He pointed a finger at her, voice shaking now, with the kind of anger that masks fear. You walk out that door and don't come back. Next time, I won't be so gentle. Dana didn't answer. She didn't flinch. She simply adjusted the lapel of her coat, turned slowly, and walked away, heels clicking softly against the tile, the only sound left in a hallway that suddenly felt too long, too wide, too full of watching eyes that dared not blink. As she passed the others, they parted without a word, clearing a path, not out of courtesy but caution, no one wanting to be next, no one willing to be first to intervene. When she reached the far end, Dana paused for a moment at the corner. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The heat in her jaw pulsed with every breath, but the pain was secondary. Insult and violation weighed heavier, the kind that burrows beneath skin and settles in the ribs. She inhaled once deeply, then disappeared around the bend, the soft click of her shoes fading like a clock winding down. Back in the hallway, Reynolds remained standing, his hands now loosely clasped behind his back, face flushed but expression trying hard to be blank. He glanced around, daring someone to speak. No one did. The air was still, and the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating like the air, just before a storm that people pretend won't come. The moment his fist made contact with her jaw, time fractured, not dramatically, not in slow motion, but in that quiet, terrible way, when something unacceptable happens in full view of everyone, and no one moves to stop it. The sound of the impact was sharp, not muffled or ambiguous, and it echoed off the marble walls with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Dana's body absorbed the blow without collapsing her feet, stumbling only a half step before she corrected herself, as if her spine refused to surrender even for a second. A curtain of her hair fell across her face, brushing against her cheekbone like a reflexive act of protection, but she didn't lift her hands to touch it right away. For a breath, she simply stood there, head slightly turned, breathing, measured the sting radiating through her jaw like heat off a stove. Around her, the hallway had frozen. A file folder lay spilled open by the bench, its papers fanned out in quiet chaos across the floor, but no one stooped to gather them. The murmurs that had filled the corridor seconds before had vanished, swallowed by a collective paralysis. Some people stared wide-eyed, others looked away immediately, pretending to be busy, adjusting collars, checking phones, fixing non-existent creases on their pants. The silence was a verdict before anyone said a word. And still Dana didn't speak. She straightened slowly, brushing the loose strand of hair behind her ear with a grace that didn't belong in moments like this. Her eyes found Reynolds' face, not with fear, not even with anger, but with the kind of cold clarity that makes a man suddenly aware of how badly he's misjudged the situation. He stood stiffly, still breathing hard, sweat breaking on his brow, as if the exertion of that one violent gesture had taken more out of him than he'd expected. His eyes darted between her and the hallway, scanning for reactions, searching for affirmation that never came. The silence had betrayed him, turned on him, abandoned him like a curtain pulled back too soon. I said, leave, he growled, the volume of his voice now compensating for the unraveling conviction behind it. You don't belong here. His hand curled again into a fist, but it stayed down, fingers twitching, not from strength but confusion. He had thrown a punch and expected obedience, humiliation, tears, but instead she had remained upright, composed, watching him like a scientist watches a reaction go wrong in a controlled environment. And now, unsure whether to escalate or retreat, he flailed in the only direction he understood: threats. Dana's voice, when it came, was soft. You've made a mistake, she said, not loudly, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. He scoffed, tried to retort, but the words caught halfway up his throat and got lost somewhere behind clenched teeth and bruised pride. She took a step back, not out of fear but finality, her body language stating that this interaction was done, that she was removing herself not because he'd won, but because he didn't even qualify as a challenge. Behind her, a group of interns from the DA's office stared wide-eyed and frozen. One of them whispered, "Did he just hit her?" And the question hung in the air unanswered, not because the answer wasn't obvious, but because saying it aloud would force accountability into a space where silence had always been safer. Dana walked past them, each step deliberate, each footfall absorbing the weight of 50 eyes that couldn't look her in the face. The hallway, so full of motion minutes before, had become a corridor of ghosts, figures unwilling to intervene, unable to look away, suspended between their own fear and their failing conscience. She rounded the corner near the elevators, her fingers brushing briefly over her lower lip, testing the damage. Her skin tingled, the ache starting to settle beneath the surface, but she didn't wince. The pain was sharp but manageable. What stung deeper wasn't the impact itself, it was the choice she'd had to make in the milliseconds between seeing the punch come and letting it land. She could have dodged, she could have blocked. She had the training, the reflexes, but retaliation meant exposure. Deflection meant disruption. Her mission demanded neither. So she'd chosen to let it land, not as surrender but as sacrifice. A strategic loss. In the mirror of the women's restroom, Dana stared at her reflection, under the flickering fluorescent lights, the yellow tint exaggerating the faint redness blooming across her jaw. She tilted her head slightly, then touched the edge of the bruise with her index finger, testing, not inspecting, as if trying to understand the shape of her restraint. Her breath fogged a small circle on the mirror's glass, and she wiped it clean with the back of her sleeve, leaving behind only the face of a woman who looked like she'd just been attacked, but felt something deeper interrupted. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the frustration, the simmering rage that wanted so badly to break free from beneath the surface. But it didn't rise. She was too seasoned, too conditioned. Rage was noise, and noise made you visible. She reached into her purse fingers, finding the phone ordinary to the eye, but housing encrypted channels few could trace. She didn't dial. Not yet. She simply held it, grounding herself in the cold familiarity of its weight. She didn't need rescue. She needed time. And silence. And the clarity to decide what came next. Back in the hallway, Reynolds still lingered near the same spot, though his posture had shifted. His arms were now hanging by his sides, and the bravado had drained from his stance like water from a broken dam. He glanced over his shoulder repeatedly, eyes scanning for someone who might confirm what had just happened, someone who might echo his distorted version of the story. But no one did. Even the janitor pushing the mop cart gave him a wide-berth, eyes, lowered lips pressed into a thin line of judgment. Dana leaned forward, turned on the tap, and splashed cool water against her face, careful to avoid the sore spot. Droplets clung to her lashes, rolled down her temples, and disappeared into the collar of her coat. She exhaled, not from pain, but from a decision settling quietly in her chest. A decision that hadn't needed words or announcements, just the simple, steady affirmation of self-worth. When she stepped out of the restroom minutes later, her stride was as composed as it had been before the incident, perhaps even more so. The hallway was quieter now, and those who had watched before now pretended to be engrossed in forms, files, or conversations that didn't matter. Reynolds was gone. She didn't ask where he'd gone. She didn't need to know. He had retreated not because he feared punishment, but because deep down he'd realized something terrifying: he had struck the wrong woman. Not just legally, but symbolically. Not a victim, but a force. And as Dana walked down the corridor once more, every step measured, every muscle in her face, relaxed, but alert. She knew with certainty that this moment would not define her, but it would define him. And that in itself was enough for now. The door to the courthouse restroom closed behind her with a soft metallic click, sealing her into a narrow world of silence and tile. The air inside was cooler, touched with the sterile scent of industrial soap and faint mildew clinging to the edges of the grout lines. Dana leaned back against the door, her fingers still wrapped loosely around the strap of her bag, and let her body absorb the stillness for a moment longer, before allowing herself to breathe out fully. She wasn't trembling, though. Her jaw throbbed in waves, each pulse reminding her that she had chosen not to react, chosen to endure. The pain was there, no doubt, but it wasn't the kind that broke her. It was the kind that clarified. She turned toward the mirror, the fluorescent light above her, flickering just slightly, humming with that low mechanical drone that made quiet feel louder. Her reflection met her eyes without apology. No tears, no shock, no cracks in the armor. Her face remained composed, save for the growing red mark on her jaw that would soon deepen into something darker. She reached up slowly, touching the bruise with 2 fingers, pressing lightly until the ache flared sharp enough to make her draw her hand back. But still, she didn't flinch, didn't curse, didn't sigh. The damage wasn't the worst part. The damage was expected. She had spent her entire adult life training for impact on the field, in boardrooms, under threat of surveillance and betrayal, and still, this was different. Not because the man was stronger or the moment surprising, but because she had chosen not to respond. That went against instinct, against protocol, against the core of her conditioning. She should have ducked, she could have deflected. But one swing could have blown months of covert work, if not more. The decision to stand still had cost her physically but protected something larger than herself. She opened her purse with quiet fingers and pulled out her phone. Not her personal one, but the agency-issued device disguised as something generic. No logos, no shine, just matte black plastic and encrypted guts. She didn't unlock it yet, just held it. Her thumb hovered above the screen as if contact might summon a voice she wasn't ready to hear. Her handler didn't know about the incident yet. Nobody did. She was still operating under her alias, still an independent analyst assigned to a minor financial investigation in a sleepy southern county, still just a bystander in the eyes of the courthouse. But inside this bathroom behind that locked door, she was fully herself again. Dana Whitmore wasn't a consultant. She was a lieutenant colonel in U.S. Army Cyber Command on loan to an interagency task force with ties deep into the intelligence community. The courtroom she'd stood outside of earlier was hearing a seemingly minor zoning appeal connected to a shell company, just one node in a larger laundering network she had been tracking for nearly 8 months. The job required proximity, observation, and absolute discretion. Now, a man with no knowledge of her mission, no sense of what his rage might cost, had jeopardized all of it with a single act of violence rooted in ego and entitlement. She looked back into the mirror again, adjusting her collar with slow, deliberate movements. The tight navy dress still sat perfectly on her frame, but now it felt heavier weighted with the heat of the confrontation and the effort it took to walk away. She'd dealt with men like Reynolds before, though rarely had they dared touch her. It wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, mistaken for someone disposable. But this time, the miscalculation had consequences he couldn't begin to imagine. She wasn't angry, not yet. Anger would come later when the paperwork was filed and the fallout measured. For now, she was calculating. Her fingers moved again this time, unlocking the phone and navigating through layers of secure interfaces that would baffle even experienced hackers. She stopped at a contact labeled Only Owl, stared at it, then powered the device off without making the call. Not yet. Escalation was a tool, not a reflex. She needed time, not permission. The system could still be tested from the inside. She still had cards to play. Outside the bathroom, the world remained unaware. People had gone back to pretending nothing happened. That's how places like this worked: quiet, conservative, and resistant to conflict. An assault in public wouldn't be denied, but it would be softened, questioned, minimized. Had she provoked it? Had it really been a punch? Had anyone seen it clearly? All the usual doubts would be planted and watered until the truth grew too heavy to carry. She could already hear the lines being written, the reports being half-filled, the footage being conveniently lost or grainy. That's why she needed to move with precision, because the truth wasn't enough, not in Crestwood County. She pulled a paper towel from the dispenser, ran it under cold water, and pressed it gently against her face, counting backwards from 10 as she let the coolness blunt the swelling. Each number was a checkpoint, each breath a signal to her nervous system to stay in control. 10, 9, 8. When she reached 1, she opened her eyes again and saw herself not as a victim but as a witness, silent, steady, and preparing to document. As she returned the towel to the trash, adjusted her coat, and ran her fingers through her hair to reset the part she was already rebuilding, the persona she would need for the next stage. The woman they had seen in the hallway would not return. In her place would be someone more strategic, more cautious, but no less dangerous. When she opened the door, the light in the hallway seemed brighter than before, or perhaps her vision had simply sharpened. She walked past the benches and bulletin boards with the same measured steps as before, but this time the air felt different. She could feel the tension lingering in the walls, taste the discomfort in the silence of those who had witnessed the scene but done nothing. She didn't blame them. That wasn't their training. It wasn't their war. The courthouse clock struck the half-hour with a muted chime overhead as she reached the far stairwell. She paused, looked over her shoulder once, not searching for him, just confirming his absence, then descended the steps, one slow footfall at a time. The sound of her heels on the concrete echoed with the steady rhythm of someone who had made a choice, accepted its cost, and was already preparing her next move. When she reached the ground floor and pushed open the exit door, the sunlight hit her face at an angle that forced her eyes to narrow for a moment. The warmth on her skin contrasted sharply, with the sting still radiating from her jaw. She turned her head slightly toward the light, took one long breath, and let it fill her lungs completely, before releasing it slowly, as if exhaling the last residue of what had just occurred. In that moment, she wasn't a soldier, a spy, or a strategist. She was just a woman who had stood her ground and chosen silence, not because she lacked the power to respond, but because she understood exactly how and when to use it. And now the silence was over. Outside the courthouse, the morning had drifted into early afternoon, and the sun, high in a washed-out southern sky, cast a dry heat across the pavement that shimmered faintly with distant movement. Dana stood still for a moment on the sidewalk beside a bench. No one ever sat on her arms crossed, not in defense but in thought, as her eyes followed the slow passing of an unmarked sedan across the street. Her mind was no longer with the slap of pain in her jaw or the echo of silence in the hallway. She had moved beyond that now. Instead, her thoughts were with a file, somewhere in her apartment across town, buried under layers of innocuous paperwork and fake ledgers. A file that outlined an entire network of shell corporations and laundered money trails linked to a source no one had been able to identify. The mission that had brought her here wasn't flashy. It didn't involve car chases, hidden microphones, or secret codes passed in dark alleyways. It was numbers, patterns, time-stamped transactions routed through non-profits, small trusts, and real estate projects that never broke ground. And the hearing this morning, seemingly about a zoning violation over a strip of abandoned land near the river, was a thread she'd been following for months. That courtroom wasn't just a courthouse, it was a portal into something deeper. And now Reynolds had broken it open with a punch he thought would scare her away. As she walked toward her car, parked 3 blocks away to avoid courthouse cameras, Dana felt the fabric of her role tighten around her like a second skin. In this town, she wasn't Lieutenant Colonel Whitmore. She wasn't the one who'd briefed generals or analyzed threat assessments that had shaped policy. Here she was simply Dana, the out-of-town financial analyst with perfect posture and polite smiles, who didn't ask too many questions out loud. And that illusion, that cover, had taken work. Layers of it. Rehearsals. Controlled slip-ups to appear believable. Because blending in isn't about invisibility, it's about believability. And right now, she knew her believability was at risk. Inside the car, the silence was comforting. She didn't start the engine. Instead, she sat with the door-closed windows up, allowing herself a moment to run her fingers gently along the side of her jaw. The pain was duller now, but still a presence, an echo of something she hadn't allowed herself to fully feel earlier. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror, not out of vanity but assessment. The swelling wasn't dramatic yet, but it was there, and tomorrow it would be worse. She opened the center console, pulled out a small compact case, and dabbed at the area with a cooling gel she kept for migraines. The touch made her eyes water just briefly, but she blinked it away without letting it fall. Her fingers moved with routine familiarity as she opened her laptop, booting it into the alternate OS, hidden behind 3 layers of decoy encryption. There she pulled up the regional intelligence feed messages coded not in classified terms, but in economic indicators and irregular audit flags. The system was simple. Her agency believed that laundering could be mapped in motion like current in a river if you watched the temperature change around the bends. Dana had spent years watching these bends. And now this courthouse was heating up in ways that had nothing to do with zoning or real estate. Something was hiding here, something that Reynolds' reaction may have accidentally protected or worse exposed. She glanced down at her phone. Her thumb hovered above the secure line again. The contact still read Owl, her handler David Chen, a man who knew her real name, her clearance level, and her limits. She thought about calling him about debriefing right now, but something held her back. Not fear, not pride. Just clarity. This wasn't the moment for escalation. It was the moment for calibration. If she went to David now, the agency would intervene in ways that might jeopardize not just her cover, but the operation itself. And that punch, for all its brutality, wasn't yet big enough to demand full exposure. Instead, she whispered to herself, "Not yet," and placed the phone face down on the passenger seat. The car remained still, the engine untouched. The air around her had gone completely still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves caught by the breeze outside. Her instincts were humming again, low, steady, like the click of a safe unlocking. Reynolds wasn't a man acting alone, maybe not in the conspiracy she was chasing, but certainly in the culture that had raised him to believe he could do what he did and walk away untouched. That culture was part of the system, too. And sometimes systems had to be tested not through brute force, but by pressure, steady strategic pressure, until the cracks revealed themselves. She reached into her bag and pulled out a clean notepad, the kind with crisp, narrow lines and a red margin she never crossed. Her handwriting was steady as she made her first note: Incident Courthouse Hallway. Officer Reynolds Michael T. Badge, number 3142. Witness count estimated 10, 15. Immediate response, none. She paused, then wrote underneath it, Observe building again at 4:00 p.m. Discreet contact courthouse maintenance staff, 3rd floor. Her pen continued moving, not just documenting what had happened, but planning her pivot around it. She wouldn't confront Reynolds again, not yet. She wouldn't go public, but she would find the leverage. Filing a complaint wouldn't stop him. But turning the light on where the shadows were thickest, that just might. If the courthouse was compromised, she needed to know how far that compromise went. If there were others, like Reynolds, more subtle, more careful, she had to map them before striking. Because her job wasn't vengeance, it was disruption. Quiet, irreversible disruption that made rot collapse under its own weight. When she closed the notebook and leaned back in the seat, the sun had shifted behind a cloud, casting the street into a softer light. Across from her car, an old man sat on a bench she hadn't noticed before, feeding a pair of pigeons with deliberate patience. He didn't look her way, didn't acknowledge her presence. But somehow the stillness between them felt like an agreement. This was her battlefield, but not every battle needed noise. Some were won in the pause, in the planning, in the quiet certainty that you were not done. Dana finally started the car, the engine purring low like a whisper. She pulled into traffic with ease, her face unreadable, her direction clear. And as she merged into the flow of town life again, she carried with her not just the weight of the punch, but the weight of knowing exactly why she had taken it and what she was about to do with it. The room smelled faintly of recycled air, old carpet, and something sterilized but not quite clean, like a space trying too hard to disguise its purpose. Dana sat with her back straight, hands resting quietly on her lap, as 2 men from internal affairs settled across from her. One older with a lined face and gray hair clipped close to the scalp, the other younger, neat, unreadable, his ballpoint pen already poised to take notes. The overhead light buzzed low, not loud enough to distract, but persistent enough to irritate, and the chairs were the kind designed to be uncomfortable after 10 minutes of stillness. No one said much at first. The older man cleared his throat and offered the usual courtesy. Thanks for coming in, Miss Jackson. She nodded once, expression, calm posture, unmoved. She was used to these kinds of rooms, the ones where people try not to show what they already believe. The questions began quietly, like a slow drip from a leaky faucet, measured, controlled, careful, not to sound accusatory, but never truly neutral. Can you describe exactly what happened? What was the officer's tone when he approached you? Are you certain he made physical contact with a closed fist? Dana answered without hesitation, her voice clear and precise, each sentence structured with intention. She didn't embellish, she didn't soften, but she also didn't lean into anger. This wasn't the space for rage, it was the space for documentation. The older man nodded slowly after each of her statements, while the younger officer scribbled quickly, not looking up once. Then came the harder questions, the ones that weren't about facts but about insinuation. Did you say anything that might have triggered the incident? Were you standing in a restricted area? Were you acting in a way that could be seen as confrontational? Dana didn't react outwardly, but inside a familiar heat bloomed in her chest. The kind that doesn't boil over but sharpens your awareness of how little people are willing to see. She kept her tone level, her breath steady, and responded as if they'd asked something logical, something necessary. No, she said. I was quiet. I stood to the side of the hallway. I said nothing to him until after he struck me. The younger officer looked up briefly at that, as if testing her eyes for a crack in the story. He didn't find one. Around her, the room felt heavier than its size, allowed as though the air itself had absorbed the discomfort of all the testimonies ever given in this space. Dana could hear a faint ticking somewhere behind her, a clock she couldn't see, counting seconds that seemed to stretch longer with each round of questioning. She noticed how the men never wrote down her exact phrasing when she described the impact, the insult, the silence that followed. They summarized, instead, reduced a moment of violence to alleged use of excessive force and escalated verbal exchange. She made a mental note of that. They asked about her job, what brought her to the courthouse, what kind of financial firm she worked for, how long she'd been in town. She answered smoothly, staying within the lines of her cover story without hesitation. The firm's name, its function, the scope of her project, everything sounded routine because it had been practiced to be. They didn't dig deeper, didn't challenge any part of her professional identity, perhaps because she didn't fit their expectation of someone making trouble. To them, she wasn't a risk, not yet. But Dana knew better. She knew the hesitation in their eyes wasn't about caution, it was about reluctance. They didn't want to see her as a victim because that would require them to see Reynolds as something more than just one of their own. And in this department, as in many small-town systems, seeing one of your own as a threat was an act of betrayal, not justice. When the interview ended, they stood up at once, signaling that the important part was over, and the rest was just procedure. The older man handed her a printed summary of the complaint she had already filed, and explained in a voice that managed to sound both sympathetic and bored that the matter was under formal review, and she'd be contacted if further clarification was needed. "We appreciate your cooperation," he added already, turning toward the door. Dana walked out alone down a narrow hallway that smelled of floor wax and resignation. No one made eye contact. No one asked if she was all right. As she pushed through the exit and felt the sunlight hit her skin, she exhaled not from relief, but from the need to reset her focus. The pain in her jaw had faded to a dull ache, but the real wound was the process itself, the hollow echo of a system built to discourage resolution. She could already feel the weight of inertia bearing down on the investigation, the kind of quiet indifference that lets stories like hers evaporate before they are ever written down in full. That afternoon she went back to her temporary apartment, a furnished two-bedroom unit in a bland complex on the edge of town where nobody asked questions, and the mail always arrived late. She didn't unpack anything, didn't sit down to rest. Instead, she opened her laptop, logged into a secure mirror of the department's civilian complaint portal, and read through archived summaries of internal investigations from the past 7 years. She wasn't looking for entertainment. She was looking for patterns. Officer Reynolds's name showed up twice in vague references to inappropriate handling of disorderly subjects and unconfirmed accusations of bias, both marked as closed with insufficient evidence and both nearly a decade old. But what caught her attention wasn't his name, it was the language. The same terms, the same legal buffering, the same half-sentences that distanced the department from accountability. She read for 3 hours straight, compiling notes on formatting, terminology, and delay tactics. It was all part of the larger architecture, and now she was inside it. By sunset, she sat by the window looking out over the complex's small parking lot, where a lone child rode a scooter in uneven circles beneath the fading orange sky. Dana didn't feel tired. She felt alert, sharpened as though every sensory receptor had come online and refused to turn off. She had taken the first steps through the front door of a system designed to close itself behind you, but she had no intention of letting it close. The air around her was warm, but her skin felt cool to the touch, as if her body was conserving energy for something that hadn't yet arrived. She took a sip of water, closed her eyes briefly, and pictured the hallway again, the look in Reynolds's eyes, the silence of the bystanders, the weight of her own restraint. It wasn't regret that followed, it was resolve. When she opened her eyes, the child had gone inside the sky, had dimmed to a deep blue, and the lights in the parking lot had begun to hum. And Dana, still seated by the window, found herself staring not at what had been, but at what would come next, fully aware that justice in places like this rarely came willingly. It had to be cornered, named, and dragged into the light, and she was just getting started. Night had settled over the small town in that quiet, creeping way it often does in places where not much changes. The hum of air conditioners echoed through the apartment walls, mixing with the occasional bark of a distant dog and the low thrum of a late-night pickup rolling down the street. Dana sat alone at the edge of her bed, the room dimly lit by a single lamp in the corner, its warm glow casting soft amber shadows against the beige walls. Her feet rested flat on the carpet bare, and still, while her hands moved with practiced care, removing her earrings one by one, setting them down beside her phone like ritual steps before something important. She hadn't planned to call tonight. She had wanted to wait to gather more evidence to file more precisely worded complaints, to test the system from within until it either responded or collapsed under its own indifference. But the bruising on her jaw was growing darker by the hour, and with every glance in the mirror, she felt the weight of a question that refused to leave her alone. How much silence is still strategic, and how much becomes surrender? She reached for the phone, turned it face up, and tapped in a sequence of numbers, too complex for muscle memory but too familiar to forget. The screen flickered once, then unlocked with a small green pulse. She hesitated not because she doubted the next step, but because she knew what it meant. Calling him meant this was no longer just about her. It meant pulling in the full weight of the organization, shifting her personal violation into federal territory. And once that line was crossed, there was no crossing back. She pressed the encrypted call icon and waited. No ringtone, just a short, compressed click before a low male voice answered, calm and alert. Owl speaking. Dana inhaled once slowly, letting the silence sit just long enough to signal wait. "This is Sparrow," she said. "I need to file an incident, mission impacting. Immediate attention required." A pause on the line, then the voice returned slightly more focused. "Go ahead, Sparrow." What happened? She told him everything, without dramatics or hesitation, just the facts recounted clearly and chronologically. She described the hallway, the officer, the blow, the stillness that followed. She mentioned the internal complaint, the procedural frostbite she'd encountered, the witnesses who wouldn't speak, and the fear pulsing beneath their silence. She could feel his breathing on the other end of the line shift subtly when she named the officer. "You're sure it was deliberate?" he asked. She didn't blink. It was deliberate. Not just the action, but the message behind it. The line remained quiet for a moment too long, and Dana pictured David Chen, the man known only to most agents as Owl, seated in a dark office, fingers tented beneath his chin, eyes narrowed towards something no one else could see. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer but sharper. "Does it compromise your cover?" she answered without pause. "Not visibly, but it risks entangling the mission in unnecessary optics if it escalates further." There was another pause. "You want us to step in?" Dana's voice dropped half a register. "I want him to understand who he laid hands on, and I want that understanding to travel upward, not outward." She didn't want a press conference. She didn't want a lawsuit. She didn't need headlines or sympathy or viral footage, with blurry context and divisive comments. What she wanted was pressure. Quiet, precise, institutional pressure, the kind that shifts chairs in meetings and makes arrogant men suddenly very cautious. She wanted her identity confirmed behind closed doors, passed not through media channels but through the internal veins of the system he had always trusted to protect him. Chen understood. That was why he'd been her handler for years. "Leave it with me," he said. "I'll elevate it discreetly. If Washington calls them, they'll listen." Dana closed her eyes and leaned her head back, exhaling into the silence. "Thank you," she said. And for the first time since it had happened, she let her voice carry a trace of fatigue, not weakness, but honesty. After the line disconnected, the screen faded to black, and Dana sat in the dimness again, the quiet around her, no longer oppressive but thoughtful. She placed the phone beside her on the nightstand, and stood slowly stretching her arms overhead until her spine cracked softly in protest. Across the room, the curtains had shifted with the breeze from the window, letting in a slice of moonlight that spilled across the floor like spilled water. She walked to it barefoot, the carpet soft beneath her soles, and stood there for a long moment, looking out at the stillness of the town. From this height the world looked peaceful, porch lights glowing faintly, trees rustling without urgency, a single moth tapping at the glass like it had somewhere to be. But Dana knew that peace, real peace, was always more fragile than it appeared. It could be disrupted in a second by the wrong hand, the wrong assumption, the wrong man with a badge, and no accountability. And if she had the power to hold that disruption accountable, then it was her responsibility to use it. Her hand brushed against the side of her face again, not to check the bruise this time, but to remind herself that it was still there, that it happened, that the choice to remain still in that hallway wasn't passive, it was a calculated move in a much longer game. Now the rules had shifted. Now there would be consequences, not loud, not immediate, but precise. The kind that moved quietly behind closed doors and arrived without warning. She drew the curtain halfway closed, leaving a sliver of light visible, then turned off the lamp with a gentle flick of her fingers. As the room slipped into darkness, she felt her heartbeat settle slow, and even not out of comfort but certainty. The wheels had been set in motion. She had chosen her moment. And now, somewhere across the country, in a room filled with men who had never heard her name before tonight, someone was going to learn exactly who Dana Whitmore was. And that knowledge alone, that quiet, irreversible shift in balance, was enough for now. The call came just after 10 in the morning, slipping through the standard switchboard and landing on Sheriff Howard Thompson's private extension like a pebble dropped into still water. He had just finished his second cup of coffee, 1 sugar, no cream, and was looking over the latest patrol rotation schedule when his phone buzzed once, then again, sharp and insistent. The number on the screen wasn't familiar, but something about its formatting, the prefix, the blank label, the absence of digital trace, told him this wasn't a casual call. He picked up without hesitation, his voice even professional. Sheriff Thompson speaking. What answered wasn't a voice he knew, but one that carried weight, the kind of tone that didn't need to be loud to be felt. This is the office of the Director of the CIA. We're contacting you regarding a personnel matter of national concern. Thompson sat up straighter, his pulse rising half a beat, though his voice remained measured. Go ahead, he said. The voice didn't hesitate. One of your officers, Thomas Miller, was involved in an incident at the Sterling County Courthouse. The woman he assaulted is a covert officer, with our agency currently conducting a mission of federal importance. The silence that followed was brief but heavy. Thompson felt it settle in the room like a sudden drop in air pressure. He didn't interrupt. He knew better. We're not here to direct your actions, Sheriff, the voice continued. But we are making a formal request for an internal investigation to be conducted thoroughly and immediately. The safety and operational cover of our officer were compromised, and we are watching closely. Then, without further ceremony, the call ended, leaving Thompson staring at the phone in his hand, the steady hum of fluorescent lights suddenly far too loud. He stood slowly, ran a hand over his bald head, and walked to the window, looking out over the station's small lot, where a deputy leaned against a cruiser, sipping from a styrofoam cup. The sky was gray clouds, threatening rain that might never come, and for the first time in months, Thompson felt the ground shift under his feet. He'd been in law enforcement for 32 years, long enough to know that some calls changed the direction of everything that came after. This was one of them. He turned back to his desk, picked up the phone again, and dialed the internal line for Captain David Riley, head of internal affairs. When Riley answered, Thompson didn't bother with pleasantries. Get in here, now! Less than a minute later, the door opened and Riley stepped in, brows already furrowed. Sir Thompson motioned for him to sit, then leaned forward, elbows on the desk, voice low and deliberate. We have a problem. A big one. CIA just called. The woman Officer Miller struck, she's one of theirs. On assignment. Undercover. Riley blinked. Once. Twice. Jesus, he muttered under his breath. Exactly, Thompson said. They're not threatening us, but they're expecting this to be handled fast and clean. No stalling. No cover-ups. No screw-ups. Riley nodded slowly, the weight of the moment sinking in. Do we know what she was doing here? Thompson shook his head. They wouldn't say. Doesn't matter. What matters is Miller hit a federal asset and we didn't know. And now we're on notice. Riley sat back, exhaling through his nose, hands clasped tightly together. I'll pull everything he said. His record, the footage, all prior complaints. I'll re-interview everyone who was in that hallway. No shortcuts. Thompson watched him carefully, then gave a single nod. Do it today. I want something on my desk by morning. Riley stood without another word and left the room, already pulling his phone from his pocket as he walked. For the rest of the morning, the station shifted subtly like a machine, changing gears, quiet but unmistakable. The same coffee brewed, the same radios, crackled, the same doors, creaked open and shut, but the tone had changed. Officers spoke in lower voices, clerks moved faster, and in the middle of it all, Captain Riley moved like a man with a clock ticking in his ear. He started with the camera footage, grainy, black and white, but clear enough to show the moment Miller struck Dana, the way her head turned, with the impact the way she stood back up without flinching. Then he pulled Miller's personnel file. Pages thick with years of service commendations for time, served letters of praise, but tucked inside were complaint forms too. 3 formal accusations in the last decade. 2 for excessive force. 1 for racial bias. All internally resolved. All dismissed without disciplinary action. By early afternoon, Riley had brought in 3 staff members for follow-up interviews. The court clerk, who had been closest to the door, a young bailiff who had looked away when the shouting began, and a janitor who had been mopping floors a few feet down the hall. At first, the answers were hesitant, guarded. I didn't see much. I heard shouting, that's all. I think she just walked away. But Riley pushed gently, persistently, reminding them that this was no longer a local issue, that their cooperation wasn't just helpful, it was critical. Eventually, the stories cracked open, and inside them was the truth. Officer Miller had escalated, unprovoked. His words were inflammatory, his actions were deliberate, and Dana had never lifted a hand. That evening, Riley returned to Thompson's office, dropped a folder on the desk, and stood back as the sheriff flipped through page after page of transcribed testimony, still images, disciplinary notes, and a drafted recommendation for formal charges. Thompson didn't speak until he'd read every word. Then he closed the folder and looked up, eyes tired but resolved. "Good work," he said quietly. "We'll convene the board first thing Monday." Outside, the sky had darkened, and a light rain had begun to fall, gentle, steady, soaking into the cracked pavement, like an apology that had come too late. And inside that office, for the first time in a long time, the wheels of accountability began to turn, not because the system wanted justice, but because someone powerful had reminded it what the cost of ignoring justice could be. Thompson leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a long moment before saying to no one in particular he thought she was just another woman. Then, with a voice heavy and certain, he added he had no idea who she really was. And with that, he turned off the light, closed his office door, and left the truth to do what it does best: wait quietly, patiently, and then move. By the time the sun had climbed halfway over the courthouse dome the next morning, Dana was already walking its hallways, again not with the anonymity of the first time, but with the quiet, deliberate presence of someone retracing a crime scene in search of something that still clung to the walls. The marble floors echoed with every step, her heels tapping in that same steady rhythm, though now there was an added awareness to her gait, a shift in weight that suggested calculation over routine. She wasn't here to relive what happened. She was here to observe what had changed and what hadn't. The hallway where Miller struck her looked exactly the same, down to the scuff mark near the baseboard by the vending machine and the faint ring of coffee stain that no one had bothered to scrub clean. The building, like the system that ran it, didn't rearrange itself after harm had been done. It simply kept moving, filing paperwork and closing doors, as if pain left no mark unless someone bled in the record books. Dana stood by the spot where it happened, tilting her head slightly, not in reflection but in search of angles. She scanned the walls for camera's eyes, narrowing just enough to catch the red blink of a motion sensor above the exit sign. It had been there all along, and yet the footage hadn't been volunteered. Her thoughts were interrupted by the passing of two courthouse clerks, one middle-aged man she recognized from before, and a younger woman with arms full of manila folders. They glanced her way briefly, eyes flickering with recognition, but neither slowed, neither smiled, and neither spoke. Fear is a language, and in places like this, it's often the only one that spreads fast enough to be understood without translation. Dana took a breath, not deep but steady, and followed the hallway down past courtroom 3, pausing at the far end where the security office shared a wall with the judge's chambers. She wasn't there to confront. She wasn't there to warn. She was there to remember every face that had witnessed her silence and everyone that had chosen to disappear behind it. And then, quietly, she began the other part of her plan, the part that required conversation, not confrontation. At recess, when the court floor thinned out and the usual shuffle of papers was replaced by the more human sounds of small talk and yawns, Dana approached a woman she'd seen on the day of the assault, an older court clerk named Martha, who wore her keys on a retractable cord and always kept her reading glasses in her hair. "Excuse me," Dana said, her voice soft but firm. "You were here the other day, weren't you? When the officer—" She paused, giving the woman room to retreat or respond. Martha froze for a second, eyes darting toward the security office, then nodded slowly. "I remember," she whispered, her voice caught between guilt and caution. "I didn't see much. I wasn't trying to get involved." Dana didn't push. She didn't offer promises or threats. She only nodded once, let a few seconds pass, and replied gently, "I understand. I didn't ask you to see everything, just what you saw." Martha hesitated, looked down at the floor, then finally whispered, "He hit you. I saw it. Nobody did anything because he's been here forever." That admission, simple as it was, cracked something open in the air between them. Dana placed a hand lightly on the woman's arm, more gratitude than persuasion, then stepped away. The seed had been planted. Later that afternoon, she returned again, not in a suit, but in a plain gray sweater and black slacks, dressed like someone looking for probate documents or jury duty deferrals. She walked past the break room, then lingered near the rear security desk, where a young guard named Kevin sat scrolling through his phone. He looked up when he saw her eyes widening for just a moment before he quickly looked down again. Dana didn't ask anything. She just waited. Eventually, he spoke, not looking at her directly. "You're the one from the other day." His voice was low, and there was something in it, not fear, not yet courage, but unease. She nodded. "I am." There was a long silence. Then he said, "I didn't think he'd really do it. I thought he was just trying to scare you." Dana tilted her head, and when he did, Kevin swallowed. I froze. I knew it was wrong, but what was I supposed to do? His hands were still clenched loosely around his phone, like he might break it out of guilt alone. Dana didn't blame him. He was young, probably new. She knew systems like this didn't train people to speak out. They trained them to look the other way, to survive the hours between paycheck and pension. "You know what happened was wrong," she said, her voice quieter now but resolute. "What happens next is up to you." And just like that, she walked away, not angry, not triumphant, just present, fully unmistakably present. By the time she stepped back outside, the light was beginning to shift the afternoon, turning the concrete warm beneath her shoes and casting long shadows across the sidewalk. She stood still for a moment beneath a patch of elm trees along the path, watching their leaves flicker in the breeze, like a silent Morse code passed between those who notice things. Others don't. She knew what came next wouldn't be easy. The system was awakening not because it wanted to, but because someone had shaken it hard enough, and now the shaking had started to ripple. People were remembering, people were whispering. And in towns like this, whispers had a way of becoming something bigger, especially when backed by a truth too heavy to bury. She reached for her phone again, not to make a call, but to open a note she'd written the night before. A list of names. A list of entry points. A map of silence waiting to be interrupted. With two witnesses beginning to stir, the current was shifting. And as she stood there in the late afternoon, light eyes steady back straight, Dana knew one thing, with absolute clarity: power, built on silence, only lasts as long as no one speaks. Today she had found two voices. Tomorrow, maybe more. And that for now was enough. When Dana walked into the internal hearing room that morning, there was no anger on her face, only that same quiet focus she had carried since the day of the assault. The kind of stillness that people often mistake for detachment, though in truth it held the weight of calculated patience. The room itself was small and unadorned, fluorescent lights, casting a pale, almost clinical glow over the long rectangular table where 3 members of the disciplinary board sat waiting. Captain Riley stood near the far end, his posture tight, his mouth drawn into a line that said he already knew this wasn't going to be routine. Dana didn't hesitate. She moved with deliberate confidence, her heels muffled against the carpet, and took her place without so much as a glance toward the man seated across the room, Thomas Miller. He looked older than she remembered. Not physically, but in the way a man looks when he knows his armor isn't working anymore. Shoulders tense, jaw locked, hands clasped too tightly together, as if trying to hold on to the last pieces of authority he thought would protect him. For the first time, he didn't speak first. He didn't sneer. He didn't interrupt. He just watched her with something between confusion and fear, unsure what version of this woman he would meet today. Captain Riley opened the hearing with a list of charges: use of excessive force conduct, unbecoming of an officer, and racially motivated assault on a civilian in a courthouse hallway. The room remained silent, as the charges echoed off the walls, sounding somehow louder than they had on paper. Dana listened without flinching. She'd read every word of the report already more than once. None of it surprised her, but hearing it out loud in front of the man who had thrown the punch gave those words a weight she hadn't fully anticipated. Riley began to present the evidence. First, the hallway security footage, grainy, but clear enough to show the exact moment when Miller's arm swung upward and Dana's head jerked with the impact. Then came the witness statements from Martha and Kevin, both read aloud in even tones, their hesitation still visible in the phrasing, but their clarity undeniable. Both had confirmed that Dana had not initiated the exchange. Both had described Miller's voice rising, his posture aggressive, his language inflammatory. The room remained still throughout, the only sound, the occasional turning of a page or the soft tap of Riley's pen against the table as he moved through the file. When it was Miller's turn to speak, his voice came out lower than expected, strained and defensive. He claimed he had felt threatened, that Dana had given him a look that challenged his authority, that she had refused to comply. His words stumbled over themselves, each one sounding more like a plea than a justification, and by the time he reached the end of his statement, there was a crack in his voice that hadn't been there before. "She was trying to provoke me," he said, as if hoping someone in the room would nod in agreement. No one did. Then Dana was asked to testify. She stood slowly, smoothed the front of her jacket with a single hand, and approached the witness chair without hesitation. Her voice, when she began, was steady and free of embellishment. She didn't dramatize what happened. She simply told it. She explained how she had been present for a public zoning hearing, how she had been standing quietly in the hallway, and how Officer Miller had approached her without reason, questioned her presence, and struck her without provocation. She detailed the exact words he used, the exact moment the air shifted, the precise impact of his fist. But what struck the room most wasn't the content of her words, it was the control behind them. She didn't yell. She didn't falter. She didn't try to make the board feel sorry for her. Instead, she laid out the truth like a blueprint. Every line measured every corner, checked every step, traced to its origin. When she finished, there was a pause, not because no one believed her, but because the clarity of her account left nothing to question. It was in that moment undeniable. Miller didn't look at her during her testimony. He kept his eyes fixed on the floor, his hands now visibly shaking. There were no more words left to defend him, no more badges or years of service that could shield him from the truth sitting across the room, embodied in a woman he had tried and failed to silence. When the board reconvened to deliver its decision, the room held a kind of quiet that wasn't peace, it was finality. Sheriff Thompson himself delivered the conclusion, his voice formal but resolute. Based on the evidence presented, the testimony provided, and the review of Officer Miller's service history, this board finds Officer Thomas Miller guilty of all charges. Effective immediately, he is dismissed from the Sterling County Police Department. He paused, then added, and the department will issue a civil restitution payment of $20,000 to Miss Dana Jackson. The sum wasn't large, not by federal standards, and certainly not compared to the damage of public trust, but the gesture carried its own significance. It was a line drawn, a statement made. Miller inhaled sharply as if trying to protest, but no words came. His mouth opened once, then closed again, and he sat there, a man who had spent decades wielding authority, now stripped of it by a truth he thought he could control. Dana didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply stood, gave a respectful nod to the board, and walked out the door the same way she had walked in, unshaken, unreadable, and whole. Outside, the late morning light had broken through the clouds, casting long streaks of gold across the courthouse steps. Dana paused for a moment before descending, breathing in the crisp air, letting the sun warm her skin where the bruise had almost faded. The people who passed her didn't recognize her. There were no reporters, no cameras, no applause. Just the sound of footsteps, the rustle of trees, and the quiet confirmation that justice, however slow and quiet, had finally moved. And in that silence, Dana felt not satisfaction, but something steadier, completion. It wasn't the end of the fight, but this chapter at least had been written, and she had written it on her terms. The morning after the hearing dawned brighter than expected, the sun pushing through thin clouds like it had something to prove, casting soft shadows across the sidewalk outside Dana's apartment, as if the light itself had been waiting for a signal to return. Inside, the air felt still but not stagnant, like a room that had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Dana moved through her morning slowly, not out of fatigue, but out of something closer to reflection. Each step unhurried, each gesture considered, her hands folding laundry, with the same quiet attention she had once given to decoding encrypted transmissions. The hearing was over, the verdict had been delivered, but the emotional residue clung to her skin like humidity, unseen yet undeniable. She hadn't cried afterward. There had been no rush of adrenaline, no breakdown in the car, no shaking hands on the steering wheel. Instead, there had only been stillness, a deep anchoring stillness that came not from satisfaction, but from the internal alignment of a long, quiet truth finally being spoken aloud and heard. And yet that stillness was not the end. It was merely a clearing in the fog. Because even though Miller was gone, his badge revoked his power, stripped his voice, silenced, she knew the system that had protected him remained intact, quietly rebuilding its defenses behind office doors and procedural language. Later that day, Dana returned to the courthouse not to stand, not to fight, but to finish. She walked through the same hallway where it had all begun now, familiar, now strange, like returning to a childhood home after it's been sold to strangers. The scuff on the marble still remained. The camera above the doorway blinked red as it always had. But something in the air was different. People looked at her now not with avoidance but with acknowledgement. A few nodded. One clerk even offered a soft good morning without looking away. Dana nodded back, a subtle smile pulling at the corner of her mouth, not because it changed everything but because it proved something had moved. She made her way to the clerk's office and handed in the last document tied to her formal complaint, a statement of closure not required but allowed. The clerk glanced at it, then at her, and gave a slight respectful dip of the head as though recognizing the quiet weight of what she'd carried into that space weeks earlier. Dana left without lingering, without making eye contact with the others in the room. She didn't need applause or gratitude. She only needed the door to close softly behind her. Outside, the trees lining the edge of the courthouse parking lot had begun to turn the first hints of yellow and red curling into the tips of their leaves, whispering that summer was loosening its grip. Dana paused for a moment under the shade, listening to the sound of a breeze moving through the branches above her, the way it rustled without force, brushing gently against everything in its path. And she thought about power, how real power often moves that way. Quiet, steady, unnoticed until it shifts the entire atmosphere. Back at her apartment, she sat at her desk with the window cracked open, the muted sounds of the town filtering in, like background music, distant traffic, a lawnmower, hummingbirds competing for territory on a telephone wire. On her screen, a report glowed unfinished, waiting for her analysis. But her mind wandered to a different kind of data, the emotional calculus of justice, and how it rarely adds up cleanly. She thought of Martha, the court clerk, who had finally spoken, her voice shaky but firm, and of Kevin, the young security officer, whose testimony had cracked open the wall of silence just enough to let the truth in. She thought of Riley, the IA captain, who against pressure and protocol had followed the trail without looking for shortcuts. And yes, she thought of Miller, his face pale and stunned in the hearing room, no longer shouting, no longer in control, just a man reduced by the weight of his own actions. Dana's reflection in the darkened laptop screen looked calm but not distant, focused but not rigid. She saw a woman who had held her ground not just in that hallway but in every quiet room afterward where doubt had tried to make itself comfortable. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't begged. She had simply stood and allowed the truth to do what it always does when given enough space: settle, reveal, reshape. As she reached for her pen, the wind shifted through the window again, carrying with it the scent of distant rain and something else, something clean, something expectant. It reminded her that storms don't always arrive with thunder. Sometimes they come as conversations in small offices, as decisions read in measured tones, as eyes that finally look instead of turn away. And so she began to write not a report, not a complaint, not even a briefing, but a memory, her own account in her own voice of what it felt like to be struck and to choose not to strike back, of what it cost to hold still and what it earned, of what it meant to be both witness and catalyst in a system that only moves when pushed from within. When she finished, she signed the last line, then closed the notebook, placing it neatly on the corner of her desk. Outside, the sky was beginning to soften, streaks of amber and lilac bleeding into the horizon as the day began its slow surrender to evening. She didn't get up right away. She just sat there watching the light change, feeling the quiet in her bones. Not as a void, but as a presence. A reminder that dignity is not silence, that restraint is not weakness, and that justice, when it comes, doesn't always roar. It sometimes arrives on feet as soft as her own. And in that moment, Dana Whitmore, no longer undercover, no longer unheard, no longer waiting, simply existed as a woman who had carried the truth across a battlefield built from marble and left it standing. Miller entered the internal boardroom that morning with the stiff gait of someone trying to summon authority from a body that no longer believed in it. His uniform was crisp, his collar pressed with care, but his hands betrayed him, fingers twitching slightly as he clutched the folded printout of his prepared statement, a speech he had rewritten 3 times the night before. The room was colder than he remembered, or maybe it was just that everyone inside had stopped warming up to him weeks ago. He glanced around as he sat, eyes searching for a familiar nod, a subtle gesture of support, but found none. Even the youngest officer in the back corner, someone Miller had once mentored, avoided his gaze. Across from him, Dana sat quietly, her presence commanding without being forceful. She didn't lean forward, didn't shift in her seat, just watched with the patience of someone who knew how systems unraveled, not with shouting but with silence. Her hands rested on the table, fingers gently laced together, and the only movement came from her eyes, steady and unwavering. The chairwoman of the board, an older woman with silver hair pulled into a no-nonsense bun, cleared her throat and began the proceedings in a tone that was neutral only on the surface. "Officer Miller," she said, "this is your opportunity to address the charges presented to this disciplinary board. You may speak now." Miller stood slowly, unfolded his statement, and began to read. His voice was flat at first, too rehearsed, too distant, as though detachment might help shield him from what was coming. "I've served Sterling County for over 29 years, he began. "My record shows dedication, discipline, and a consistent commitment to law enforcement." Dana didn't blink. The chairwoman nodded for him to continue. "What happened that morning was the result of miscommunication," he said, his voice tightening. "I interpreted the individual's behavior as evasive and possibly hostile. My response was unfortunate but not malicious." There it was, the pivot. The careful, calculated walk between apology and denial. But the board didn't flinch. Captain Riley stood folder in hand and walked to the center of the room. "Let's be clear," he said calmly. "This wasn't a miscommunication. This was a strike, with witnesses, with video, with a long record of complaints that until now never saw sunlight." He opened the folder and laid out images, transcripts, and copies of past internal warnings, none of which had ever left the department's four walls. "This board has read the statements. They've reviewed the footage. They've spoken to those who were present. The facts don't bend to comfort." Miller shifted on his feet, face flushing. "You're using old noise," he snapped, his composure cracking. "You're dragging up stuff that was put to rest." Riley didn't respond with emotion. He simply stepped back and gestured toward Dana. "She hasn't spoken yet," he said, voice low. "Let her speak." Dana rose with quiet grace, and for a moment the room stilled, not out of fear but respect. She didn't look at Miller as she spoke. Instead, she looked directly at the board, her tone even and measured. "I didn't come here to destroy a man's career," she said. "That was never my mission. But I will not pretend that what happened didn't happen. I was standing silently in a public hallway waiting for a hearing to begin. I was approached, questioned without cause, insulted, and struck in front of nearly a dozen people." Her voice never rose, but the clarity cut like glass. "I didn't respond with violence. I didn't even respond with words, because I knew in that moment if I moved the wrong way, if I said the wrong thing, the story would have been written differently." She paused and allowed the weight of that truth to settle. "I have worn a uniform. I have stood in front of men with power. I've spent years understanding how control is wielded and how it's abused. And I can tell you without uncertainty that what happened that day was not a mistake. It was a choice to dehumanize, a choice to intimidate, and now it's a choice that requires accountability." She sat back down, hands returning to their quiet clasp, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of reckoning, of shame, of the undeniable presence of a woman who had held her own dignity intact through every layer of resistance. The board took a moment before responding. The chairwoman leaned forward, her voice solemn but resolute. "We've reviewed the evidence, the testimony, the patterns, and the conduct displayed by Officer Miller both during and beyond this incident. And it is the decision of this board that Officer Miller be terminated from his duties effective immediately. Furthermore, the department will issue formal acknowledgement and restitution for the harm done." Miller's face fell. Not dramatically, not with protest, but in a slow unraveling of everything he had built his image upon. He lowered his eyes, gripped the edge of the table, and said nothing. Dana didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her job wasn't to witness his fall, it was to reclaim her place in a room where people like her were never meant to be silent. When the hearing adjourned, the air outside the building was heavy with late afternoon heat, but it felt different now, less oppressive, more honest. Dana stepped out into the brightness, her shadow falling long behind her across the courthouse steps. She paused, inhaled slowly, and for the first time in days exhaled without a second thought. There were no cameras, no crowd, just the sound of cicadas starting their evening song and the wind threading through the leaves of a nearby oak. She glanced upward, her eyes tracing the sky as it shifted from hard blue to the beginnings of dusk, and felt something ease inside her chest. Not closure, not victory, but peace. Because justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about the moment someone who's spent their life invisible becomes fully seen. And in that still, unhurried silence, Dana Whitmore stood as nothing more, and nothing less than exactly who she was, and that in itself was everything. By the end of the week, the news had already begun to fade, not because it wasn't significant, but because there was no headline to carry it, no video clip to go viral, no camera waiting outside the courthouse when Officer Thomas Miller walked out without his badge, his nameplate, or the uniform he had worn for almost 3 decades. The town went on, as towns often do, quietly absorbing the consequences without announcing them. The storefront still opened at 9, the mail still arrived just after noon, and the hum of lawnmowers and porch conversations still floated through the air as if nothing had changed. But Dana knew better. Something had shifted, not in noise or spectacle, but in posture, in how people looked at her now, and in how they looked at themselves when she passed. She spent that Friday morning alone at a small cafe on the edge of town, tucked in a corner booth with a clear view of the courthouse steps through the front window. The coffee was bitter, too strong, but familiar in a way that comforted more than it offended. She stirred it slowly, not to cool it, but because movement felt better than stillness, and her mind was still moving even if her body had stopped. There was no plan now, no strategy to execute. No handler waiting for the next report. Just her, a quiet town, and a space that had finally given her room to breathe. The bell above the door chimed softly as someone entered, and Dana looked up instinctively, not out of suspicion, but habit. It was Captain Riley. He saw her before she had a chance to decide whether to acknowledge him, and instead of avoiding the moment, he walked toward her table with the careful steps of a man who didn't want to overstep. "Mind if I sit?" he asked. Dana nodded once and gestured toward the other side of the booth. He sat down slowly, removing his cap, folding his hands on the table like someone about to give an apology without using the word. They sat in silence for a few moments, the cafe's low chatter filling the background like white noise. Then he finally spoke. "It should have happened a long time ago," he said. Dana didn't respond, didn't need to. He continued, his voice quieter now. "There were complaints before. We ignored them, told ourselves it wasn't enough. That he just needed a warning. That maybe the people complaining were exaggerating. But you didn't flinch. You didn't let it slide past. And that forced us to look harder." She looked at him for a long moment, searching his face, not for regret, but for understanding. And she saw it there in the crease of his brow, in the way his eyes didn't waver under hers. "You did the right thing," she said finally. "When it counted." Riley exhaled through his nose, a small gesture of release. "I just wish it didn't take this much to count." They sipped their coffee in silence after that, letting the weight of those words settle without needing to move them. Then he stood, thanked her softly, and left. The bell above the door chimed again, and Dana was alone once more. But something in the air felt lighter. She left the cafe an hour later and walked the long way home past the town square, where the fountain sputtered unevenly and children played tag between the benches. She passed the library, the grocery store, the quiet office building where her fake consulting firm still rented space for the sake of appearances. As she walked, people nodded. Some smiled. A few looked away, unsure how to meet her gaze. But no one ignored her anymore. At the edge of the square, she saw Martha again, the older court clerk who had testified, despite the risk, despite the fear. She was carrying 2 paper bags, and when she spotted Dana, she hesitated, then shifted one to her other arm and walked over. "Miss Jackson," she said, her voice warm, steadier than it had been weeks ago. "I just wanted to say, I'm glad you didn't back down. I think you gave some of us more courage than we knew we had." Dana smiled gently, her voice soft. "You gave it to yourselves. I just made sure someone was watching." Martha nodded, touched her arm briefly, and said goodbye. The breeze picked up as Dana continued walking, carrying with it the scent of distant cut grass and blooming crepe myrtles, the kind of smell that reminded her of summers long past, of being young and underestimated and taught to stay quiet for the sake of peace. She thought about that silence now, how it had shaped her but not defined her, how it had taught her to listen first, speak carefully, but also how to stand still when everyone else scattered. There was strength in silence, but only when it came from choice, not fear. As she turned the corner toward her apartment building, the late afternoon sun cast long golden shadows across the pavement, and Dana paused for a moment, eyes closed, letting the warmth press against her face like a quiet acknowledgement. She didn't feel victorious, and she didn't feel angry. What she felt was anchored. Present. The storm had passed, and though the cleanup might stretch on longer than anyone could see, the damage had not gone unspoken. Inside the apartment was as she had left it, neat, minimal, the walls still bare, except for a single framed photo on her dresser. It was a picture of her in uniform standing beside her father who had served before her. They were both younger in that image, their eyes sharp, their posture straight, their arms at their sides like mirrors. She looked at it now, not with longing but with recognition. She wasn't who she had been then, but she was still someone who carried a code even if the battlefield had changed. She poured herself a glass of water, stood by the window, and watched as the last of the day stretched out across the rooftops like an exhale. The courthouse was behind her now, not erased, not forgotten, but finished. And in that stillness, Dana understood something deeper than victory, something truer than revenge. Accountability isn't the end of a fight. It's the beginning of a culture, remembering how to look at itself without blinking. And in that moment, standing alone with nothing left to prove, she finally allowed herself to feel what she had denied for weeks. Not pride, not relief, but peace. A peace earned, not given. A peace held, not claimed. A peace that would remain even as the world outside continued unaware. It wasn't until the last file was signed, sealed, and quietly handed off to the department's legal liaison that Dana allowed herself to believe this part of the process was over. Not resolved, not undone, just over. The room where it happened, the hallway where the silence spread, the courtroom where truth finally sat upright, none of them had changed their shape or color, but her place inside them had. For weeks, she had navigated each step with the precision of someone balancing on a line only she could see. Now standing in the small office with the window cracked and the fan ticking softly beside the desk, she breathed not deeply but fully, like someone reclaiming space inside her own ribs. The air smelled faintly of paper and lemon-scented, cleaner, the kind that lingers in government buildings no matter how many windows you open. Dana glanced at the desk one last time, then turned to go the door, closing behind her with the quiet weight of finality. Outside, the late afternoon sun cut sharp angles across the sidewalk, and the breeze that touched her cheek wasn't warm or cold. It was neutral, present, like the kind of weather that doesn't insist on being noticed. She walked slowly toward the street, her heels clicking softly against the pavement, not out of uncertainty but because she had no desire to rush anything anymore. At the curb, she paused as a school bus passed its windows, streaked with sunlight and fingerprints, children's voices bouncing through the open panes. One of them, a girl, maybe 9 or 10, looked out and waved as if Dana were someone she recognized, or perhaps just someone who looked like she belonged. Dana raised a hand instinctively, then let it fall gently, her fingers brushing against her coat as she turned the corner toward the square. There was something about that small gesture that stayed with her, something about being seen not through the lens of conflict but simply as a person walking down a street. She made her way toward the cafe again, not because she needed coffee, but because it had become a kind of quiet checkpoint, a place to sit, to observe, to transition. The door chimed the way it always did, and the same young man behind the counter greeted her with the same quiet nod. "Afternoon, Miss Jackson," he said. "Your usual?" She smiled and said, "Yes, thank you." And there was no hesitation in his voice this time, no uncertain glances, no calculated politeness, just a rhythm that had finally settled into something natural. She took her drink to the same table by the window facing the courthouse and sat with both hands wrapped around the warm ceramic, watching the people move in and out of the building across the street. She didn't study them, not anymore, but she noticed. The way they carried their folders, the way they checked their watches, the way some glanced over their shoulders more than once. Everyone lived with a weight they rarely named. Her own she had carried like a stone in her pocket, smooth from handling, familiar in shape and weight. But today it was lighter. Not gone, but light enough to stop defining the way she walked. A few minutes later, someone slid into the chair across from her. It was Martha again, the court clerk, who had broken her own silence to help Dana bring the truth to light. She looked better, more rested, more certain, and when she spoke, her voice had gained a new texture. "I heard the final report came through this morning," she said, adding a soft smile. "They're not going to appeal." Dana nodded, setting her cup down. "I figured. It would draw more attention than they can afford." Martha leaned in, slightly lowering her voice, even though no one was listening. "You know, people are still talking about it quietly, but they're talking. Not just what happened. What you did afterward." Dana raised an eyebrow gently. "What I did," Martha nodded. You made people stay in the room. You didn't let anyone look away. And somehow you didn't burn it all down in the process." Dana didn't answer right away. She looked down at her cup, traced a finger along the rim, and thought about how many times she could have chosen a louder path, a faster one, a messier one. "I didn't want revenge," she said quietly. "I wanted them to see the truth and have to live with it." They sat together for a while, watching the courthouse fade into golden light as the sun drifted toward evening. Eventually, Martha stood and placed a hand on Dana's shoulder. Not heavy, not performative, just real. "You changed more than you know," she said. "And not just for us." Then she was gone, her footsteps soft against the tiled floor, the bell above the door ringing once behind her. Dana stayed a little longer, letting the light shift across the floor and up the wall behind her, letting the warmth settle into her chest without asking it to last. Change doesn't always announce itself. It moves in like water seeping through stone, slow, steady, inevitable. You don't always feel it in the moment. Sometimes you only recognize it later when the weight in your voice has lifted, or the fear in someone else's eyes has turned into trust. She rose from her seat when the cafe began to empty, returning her cup to the counter and thanking the young man with a nod. The street outside was quieter now, the courthouse windows glowing dimly as the last staff filtered out for the evening. She walked along the sidewalk without destination, letting her feet carry her past closed shops and darkened windows, past the library, the post office, and finally to the edge of the park. There, beneath the tall oaks, she paused again, just long enough to tilt her head back and look at the sky where the first stars were beginning to pulse faintly through the velvet dusk. She didn't wish for anything. She didn't pray. She just stood there, breathing in the coolness, letting it settle into the corners of her mind that had once braced for impact. And in that stillness, in that moment that needed no words and no conclusions, Dana understood what it meant to survive something without becoming it. To confront power without losing grace. To speak truth and still walk away whole. That was her ending. Not the fall of a man, not the punishment of a system, but the quiet dignity of a woman who had stayed true and was finally free to go anywhere she pleased. The day Dana left Sterling County for good was quieter than she had expected, not the ceremonial kind of quiet, but the natural stillness that comes when a place has already said everything it needed to. She didn't announce her departure. She didn't wait for anyone to see her off. There was no need for closure with people who had never truly opened their doors in the first place. Instead, she packed her few things in silence, folded each shirt and document with the same care she had given to testimony, to reports, to strategy. Everything precise, intentional, measured not for drama but for order. Outside, the morning air was cool with the last grip of fall, the kind that hinted at winter without quite committing. Leaves rustled across the sidewalk as she loaded her bag into the trunk of her rental, the distant sound of a lawn blower, buzzing like a tired insect 2 streets over. She paused once to look at the building she'd called home these past months, not to remember it but to confirm that it no longer held any part of her. The curtain in the window still hung slightly, crooked, the result of a rushed move-in. A crack in the driveway still caught rainwater like a shallow scar, but none of it belonged to her anymore. As she got into the car and pulled out of the lot, she took the long way through town, not because she was nostalgic, but because she had learned long ago that leaving isn't always a straight line. The streets were familiar now, but not intimate. She passed the library, the faded blue mailbox outside the post office, the diner where she'd once watched 2 deputies gossip over coffee without noticing her in the booth behind them. Every building held echoes, but none called her back. That in itself was a kind of peace. When she reached the courthouse square, she slowed, letting her tires crunch softly over the gravel lining the curb. The building stood unchanged, grand in the way old institutions like to be: white columns, symmetrical windows, a clock that almost always ran 3 minutes late. For a moment she considered parking and walking one last lap through the hallways. But she knew there was nothing left for her inside. The truth had already passed through those walls. The work was already done. As she sat there, foot resting on the brake, a familiar figure stepped out from the side entrance, Captain Riley alone, head slightly bowed, a folder tucked under one arm. He didn't see her right away, but when he did, his steps slowed. She lowered the window just enough to meet his gaze. He walked over, stopping at the driver's side with a hesitant smile. "You heading out?" he asked, voice quiet, more a confirmation than a question. She nodded. "Time to go." He looked down at the folder, then back at her. "We finalized the review this morning. Internal Affairs has filed the full report with the state. She raised an eyebrow and he added, "No redactions, no edits." Dana let that sit between them for a moment, then said simply, "Good." Riley leaned slightly against the car, not intruding but present. "You know we'll probably be feeling the fallout of this for months," he said, tone more reflective than bitter. "But maybe that's the point." She looked at him fully now, her voice low but unwavering. "The point was never to punish. The point was to prove that no one's untouchable." He nodded slowly, the weight of that truth visible in the way his shoulders settled. "I hope you know you changed things here," he said. "Maybe not loudly, but permanently." Dana didn't respond with words. Instead, she held his gaze for a beat longer, then offered a small, quiet nod. He took the cue and stepped back from the car. "Take care of yourself," he said. "You too," she replied, then rolled the window back up. As she pulled away from the curb, she didn't look in the rearview mirror. She had already seen what she needed to see, someone standing in a place they now understood a little more deeply, someone who would remember her not for what she endured, but for how she chose to respond. The highway out of town opened like a ribbon ahead of her, long and steady. The horizon stretched wide with the promise of something unnamed. There was no destination plugged into the GPS, no office waiting at the other end. For the first time in a long time, her direction wasn't dictated by protocol or pressure, it was chosen. She drove with the window cracked just enough to let in the sound of the wind, the soft hum of the tires on asphalt blending with the rhythm of her thoughts. She didn't replay the courtroom or the hallway or the cold room where Miller tried to rewrite his own story. She didn't need to. Those moments had served their purpose, left their imprint, and moved on just like she was. At a rest stop an hour down the road, she pulled over briefly, stepped out, and stretched beneath a canopy of pine trees that whispered with the sound of distant breeze. There was no crowd here, no noise, just a vending machine humming beside the restroom wall, and the chirping of birds nesting above the lights. She walked to the edge of the lot, where a faded bench overlooked a shallow ditch filled with golden leaves. She sat for a moment, letting the silence fill the spaces that had been crowded by tension for so long. And then she did something small, almost insignificant. She smiled. Not for the victory, not for the justice, but for the rare and quiet clarity of knowing she had done exactly what needed to be done without losing herself in the process. Then, with a long breath and a last glance at the open road ahead, Dana stood, dusted off her palms, and walked back to the car. No music, no fanfare, just the sound of the engine starting and the steady rhythm of a journey that no longer needed a map. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Some places stay with you without ever asking you to return. In life, there are moments when we must stand up not to make noise, but because the truth can no longer be ignored. Dana's story isn't just about justice, it's a lesson in resilience, in holding on to one's dignity when others choose to look away. For those who've lived through life's many trials, we know silence can be wise, but silence in the face of wrongdoing is a form of surrender. Dana didn't fight with anger, she chose composure. She chose to let the truth speak through her actions, not through noise, and it was that quiet strength that forced an entire system to change. So no matter your age, remember dignity has no expiration date, and sometimes it only takes one calm voice refusing to step aside for the whole world to stop and pay attention. If this story moved you, if you believe that truth and dignity are still worth standing up for, leave a like to support that spirit. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more stories filled with emotion, meaning, and power like this one. Because every share helps spread the message and gives strength to those who still need a voice.